Hey guys, this is your friend Dhruv Tyagi, and we are back with Nights of Reason. And with me is Abhishek Saini. Hi Abhishek.
Hi Dhruv, hi everybody.
Hi. So we discussed a few of the topics from history and science and religion and reason last time. We will pick up from there, maybe discuss a little bit of the depth in what topics we discussed last time. But before that, some of our friends sent us some questions. So maybe we can share those questions first and maybe give our reviews to what the questions are and maybe give some comments to the questions. First question is from Arpita Saha, who is a friend of ours. We both know her. And let's hear the question.
Hi guys, it was an interesting discussion the last time that you had regarding science and religion. And I have a comment or a question regarding one of the aspects that Dhruv mentioned. He said that science only proves something which is natural or states something that is natural. I would say it's not completely correct that science always states everything which is natural, because in modern science, we use a lot of simulations, a lot of softwares, and a lot of fitting data or statistics which are modeled upon calculations which are made by humans. So that's not natural. And most of the data or the experiments are proved by techniques or characterized by techniques which are made by humans and using these kind of softwares. So is it all natural in science, or it is that we only want to prove what we want to prove by using these calculations and fitting the data according to what we imagine is the correct thing?
So Arpita has a really nice question, and it's not an easy one. So because it's mostly addressed to me, so maybe I can attempt to answer what I think. So Arpita, what I think is where the confusion is the definition of what natural means. So in this particular context, when we are talking about religion and science, then the concept of naturalism comes from natural and supernatural, not natural and artificial. So natural and artificial is something which we discuss when we are discussing about something which is, well, already there in, let's say, biology and physics. But artificial means something which is human made. But when we talk about the philosophical realm of science, then we are talking about natural and supernatural. Supernatural means which has no basis in natural world. And how we define natural is through the laws of physics, which are natural laws of physics. So for example, laws of motion or laws of gravity are natural laws. We can of course write them in mathematical equation. For example, gravity, if we want to calculate the force of gravity, then we use g m1 m2 by r squared. That doesn't mean that these equations, even though that's man-made, that's how we denote those equations or denote those forces, but they are natural forces. So the denotation is artificial, which is human-made, but the forces are natural. So when I was talking about that science only deals with natural world, then what I actually meant was that we have no way whatsoever of confirming a supernatural being. That was my comment for that particular thing. Another thing also is that many a times what we do is we try to fit in, like you say, we try to fit in data for the hypothesis that we have. Sure, we do that curve fitting and everything, we do all of those things, but they will never. So if they disagree with the initial hypothesis, then we cannot even fit it. So fitting is done according to what data we get and if it matches our initial hypothesis. So that's how it works. Maybe we can take another question. This time I will post, it's a text message from my friend Shashwat in Taiwan. So the question is, his question is regarding solving different problems in life with rational thinking. Does this rational thinking helps in decision making in personal life problems or relationship building? he meant specifically about love relationships. So I think this question can clearly be answered by Abhishek Saini. This is right up his alley. Go ahead, Abhishek.
Okay, yeah. Firstly, thank you for the question, Shashwat. And it's nice to see that we already have an international reach. We're getting questions from Taiwan. So that's pretty good. Well, to answer your question, it's, well, of course, I'm no authority, but I'll try to answer the best as I can. When you're talking about applying rational method, scientific method to answer any question, the most important thing in that regard is first we need to have data. Science does not work without data. So if you're trying to apply a rational method of thinking to human relationships, be it love relationship or whatever, the issue is if you compare real life to fiction, whenever we are as a reader or as a viewer, whenever we're viewing relationships in fiction, we know the truth from both sides. We have data from both parties. In real life, it does not work like this. You can be sure of how you feel, but you can never be 100% sure of how the other person feels. So that means you lack sufficient data. So in that case, how do you apply a rational method? How do you apply the scientific method without data from both sides? So in that case, I believe it is better to go with your gut feeling rather than, because feelings is something that you cannot rationalize, as I said, because you lack data from both sides. So better to go with your gut feeling. That's how I would say.
Yeah, so I think that pretty much sums up the answer for Shashwat's question. Thank you, Shashwat, for the question. Now, maybe I think because we have been discussing even with the questions which Arpita and Shashwat posed about rationality and its relation to the real world and the real life applications. So I think maybe it's a good starting point for where we left last time, which was we were discussing Age of Enlightenment, sometimes called Era of Enlightenment. So maybe Abhishek, maybe you can give like a 2-minute brief of what Era of Enlightenment is and what it was at that particular time, because it was not called Era of Enlightenment at that time. Of course, it's a new term, relatively new term. So what that is and what effect did it make? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so the Era of Enlightenment, we can briefly say that, well, colloquially, we can say it started in the 1600s, 1700s, and so on. It followed the Renaissance, and it was before the industrial period, as it is referred to in our history books. Some of the most famous philosophers of the modern world, such as Descartes, Voltaire, John Locke, and so on, all of them belong to this Age of Enlightenment. What essentially is the Age of Enlightenment is that the world was changing. European powers were colonizing the world. They had discovered a whole new world, be it in Asia or in South America. So a lot of the previous dogmas or the way of life that they had known to exist for 1500 years were now changing. Of course, when things like this happen, society undergoes a change. So there were a lot of new questions that they were asking that had no answer in the Bible or whatever religious text, the Jewish text that they followed at the time. So this led to the rise of a lot of philosophies where people thought that perhaps the answer is not in religion. The real answer lies in rational thinking or applying a scientific method, as I referred to previously, in analysis of data. You only view the world from what you can actually observe rather than believing in a supernatural deity. So this way of thinking is what led to the Age of Enlightenment, and this eventually graduated into our Industrial Revolution, leading to a scientific growth and, of course, moving into our modern world. So yeah, I would say this is a brief overview.
Yeah, so yeah, that pretty much sums what Era of Enlightenment was. And so we were discussing that most of the scientific revolutions that came after the Era of Enlightenment were a result of many of these philosophers, like you mentioned, Descartes and John Locke, and there was, George Berkeley and Voltaire was there, and also Leibniz was there, so who had a lot of influence on the mathematical world at the time. So maybe we can discuss a bit about how much influence did it really make on the world, especially becoming a precursor or the catalyst for the Industrial Revolution, which later came, and how did it influence the thought process of the scientists of that time, like Newton and so on, like so many. So how do you see the relation between, let's say, the philosophers of that time, because those philosophers were not really answering scientific questions. They were trying to give an epistemological viewpoint to the world, that how we know what we know. And these answers were really important for the development of the scientific method later, which we got especially as a precursor for the Industrial Revolution, especially with steam engines and development of machinery. So how do you see these relationships between what these philosophers were thinking and how the world actually turned out? And what changed from Renaissance period to this era of Enlightenment? Yeah.
Well, to answer your last question first, whatever changes in every era is that we get new information and we change our existing society, our existing dogmas based on that new information. So in a word, what changed was we got new information. But it's interesting that you mentioned so many scientists and philosophers, because one thing that it is important to understand, and maybe it is a bit weird from our present point of view, in the 1600s or before, science and philosophy were not two different branches. They were not practiced by different people. Science and philosophy went hand in hand. Newton would not refer to himself only as a scientist. He would have referred to himself as a philosopher, alchemist, mathematician, and so many things. At that point of time, science and philosophy went hand in hand. So what changed at that particular time was probably these philosophers, and because I'm going to refer to them as philosophers, started gradually evolving into the modern definition of scientists that we have today. Because moving away from philosophy and trying to understand how the world worked, they moved towards trying to observe how the world worked. This is very important because our modern science is based on observation rather than belief. Earlier, the way of understanding the universe was mostly based on belief in God, belief in whatever you wanted to be, in demons and angels. Towards this era of enlightenment it started moving towards observation more, and that was very, very important.
Yeah. So what we were trying to do is at that time, people were starting to ask questions about why things are the way they are, rather than getting the commandments from another external source, maybe from scriptures or from some gurus or some teachers at that time. This is an important distinction, that all these ideas were being generated in the West, not in the, so we have to keep the context right, that this was not, we are not talking about things which were happening in, let's say, India or China, or let's say even the new Islamic world. So most of these thinkings, epistemological questions, were being answered in the West. So we can say that the era of enlightenment was a foundation of the Western world as we know it today. And so this distinction is very important to get right, because India has a completely different definition of what secular values are, what the era of enlightenment brought, because we came from a very different background, especially at this particular time. And we had a very different set of problems, very different set of how we answer things. Also, you're right that these were the, let's say, new age scientists at that time, because most of these ideas were observation based, especially, let's say, what Descartes said, that I think, therefore I am. And this means that he was asking the basic fundamental questions of what existence is. And you need an observer, a brain or a mind, to actually observe the differences. And if there is no mind, then there is no observation. And if there is no observation, then there is no reality to observe. We also call this observer's effect in physics sometimes, that a little bit of observation can change the actual parameters of the actual experiment or actual observation. So we have much sophisticated methods now to actually deal with these answers. So this is very interesting, that these scientists were more objective than their previous predecessors. And so we did talk about the motivation of these people last time. So they were motivated, most of these were religious people, because there was no one else to actually do the job. So let's say if a Christian actually found the key to the era of enlightenment, that was because there was no one else to do the job. So that's something which is interesting too, in an observation there. So we already discussed what was preceded by it. Now we can discuss what was succeeded by it. And what we got after this was Industrial Revolution. So what do you think about the development of Industrial Revolution, and how was it challenged by the religion at that particular time, let's say 18th century? or so?
Well, I would say at that point, particularly the 18th and the 19th centuries, there was a lot of conflict between the New Age ideas that were developing due to the Industrial Revolution and the Old Age religious ideas. But we must also pause at this point and consider that perhaps at that time, a normal, let's say, I'm going to say a layman, who at that time a layman was probably likely to be uneducated, he would have probably preferred the religious side of the world more than the industrial side, because consider the living conditions of a lot of the people. Let's take the example of Britain. They found coal was necessary for the industrial revolution, for steam engines and for so on. Now, where do you get coal? You have to mine for it. And these coal miners would be in dark for 12 or 14 hours. They would never see light. They would suffer from asthma and so many lung diseases because of the time that they would spend inside these coal mines for all of their youth. Now, try telling to that person that science was good, that this industrial revolution was good and religion was bad. I'm sure at that point they would have disagreed. So one distinction that we must bear in mind is that it is very easy to look from our vantage point at this point and say that, yeah, religious, this dogma is what slowed our progress. But if you actually consider the needs and the trials and tribulations of the common man in those particular eras, I'm sure going back 3,000, 4,000, whatever it is, recorded history, for at least 95% of the time, people would prefer to live in a religion-dominated world than in an industrial or a scientific-dominated world, because it has brought nothing but suffering for the common man. So what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, so true that most of these developments, especially for the scientific, when science actually started giving practical solutions, that was technology. Technology is just an application of science. And that's what we were starting to get. So we had some few observations, and these observations gave us a set of ideas of how to use those particular information that we have. And that particular information, we used it to create, let's say, internal combustion engine, which was driven by, like you say, coal. And later on, these internal combustion engines turned into the cars that we have now. So all these philosophies about how the society should work, communism was a result of that too. Capitalism was a result of that too. So all of these were the successors of the era of enlightenment. That's pretty interesting. Sure. Let's discuss about what was so interesting about the age of enlightenment, that the scientific development just shot up. So instead of going linear or maybe flat, which it was going before that, especially with dark ages, and that particular development in our history just shot right up. So what changed? Like, what was happening before and what happened after? What do you think about that?
I am a firm believer of the fact that any social change that occurs is facilitated by economics. I am a firm believer of this fact. You ask what changed, I will, like I mentioned at the start, what changed was new worlds were discovered. The Europeans, the colonial powers as we refer to it them now, they discovered that there were lands in South America, in Asia, which they could easily dominate. From there, they could get a lot of natural resources that Europe was lacking. Now, this is one fundamental question that, like especially we, India, which a country which suffered through colonial rule, we are not often taught. What actually motivated the Europeans to go and colonize? It was because in the 1500s and the 1600s, Europe was a backwater compared to China and India, and we were far more developed than they were at that time. So at that point, the average age, I think I saw once in a documentary in London, was just 27. Imagine, an average person was just living 27 because the living conditions were so dire. So what motivated them was this lack of resources. They wanted to go to places they'd heard fables about it. There was a lot of riches and so on. So once they reached these places, they had to figure out ways to be able to overwhelm the local population over there. We have all heard the tales of how the Spanish conquistadors were able to dominate the Aztecs, and how did they do that? Because they had gunpowder. They had access to guns. 100 people could easily defeat 1,000. So when we talk about this age of enlightenment, what motivated it, the basic answer for me will always be economics. The Europeans at that point would have been crushed beneath their own weight had they not spread out to the world, had they not Vasco da Gama not gone to India, had Christopher Columbus not found Europe. When they found these new religions, new regions, they found a new way of living. And at that point, it is in our human nature, it is tribalism that we try to prove that our way of living is better. So essentially what these Europeans were doing were trying to prove themselves perhaps superior to these indigenous populations that they were finding. And this urge or this will to prove themselves superior is what led to the creation of not only new ideas but new technologies as well, because they realized that they were dealing with people who were far more in number. So how do you overcome numbers? You need better, superior technology. For me, this is a primary motivator. I'm not sure if you agree with me or not here.
I mean, I would say I don't agree completely, because I would say economics was a great motivator for the industrial revolution, sure, because at that time we were starting to have the practical applications of these scientific things. But the age of enlightenment was mostly driven by scientific curiosity of these philosophers. And what they were trying to do, like you said, they were trying to challenge the conventional ways of thinking about what things are. And instead of ontological arguments, they were giving more epistemological arguments. So they were trying to actually broaden the horizons of what human as humans know. So I think this was the main motivator. But sure, industrial revolution, when it came, it was all economics. Like if there was no profit and there was no well-being, then there could not be any industrial revolution, even the first one. Forget the later ones. So you're right. Okay. Let's talk about so let's go a little bit further back. Let's talk about the Islamic age. So there was a very brief time in the Islam where there was which is called the golden age of Islam. And in that golden age, there were huge scientific improvements over the past knowledge that we had. And those Islamic scholars or those Islamic scientists were doing wonders. There were so many people who were working on natural sciences. But all of a sudden it stopped because the dogma caught up with the scientific curiosity. So what do you think about the role of Islam in the development of natural sciences? And what do you think went wrong with Islam? Like, we know specifically what went wrong with Christianity, what led to the era of enlightenment, or what went wrong with Islam so that it stopped actually doing scientific progress.
I think it is very simplistic to say that religion is the cause of Islam's downfall. I mean, you're totally right in mentioning that Islam went through a golden age where they were the leaders in world science. I mean, they were great. Ulugh Beg is one name that comes to mind, who was the world's foremost astronomer at the time. I mean, it was said that the Great Library of Baghdad, which the Mongols completely destroyed, it is said it had the greatest number of manuscripts at anywhere in the world at that particular time. And a host of knowledge was lost at that time, and the Mongols burned down Baghdad and their library. What caused the Islam's to shift from this, as we call it, the golden scientific age to the conservative reputation that it has now? Again, I think it is very simplistic to say that it was solely religion. I mean, I'll give you an example. It is a bit forward than what we were discussing. The Ottoman Empire, sole Islamic empire, was in fact the first country in the world to legalize homosexuality. This is not something that we are taught. Now, and it was done in 1800s, if I'm not mistaken. Now, this goes against the image of Islam as being, totally conservative and being very, very homophobic and so on. What caused them to go back on this legalization? The Europeans. Because when the Europeans started, dominating the Middle East and becoming the power, even though the Ottomans were technically the emperors, but it was the Europeans who had the real power. In the 1900s, the Europeans, I will give, because they were Catholics, they looked down upon homosexuality. They thought it was a sin. This was something that they transferred onto the Muslims at that time in the Ottoman Empire, and this is what led to the Muslims adopting, because they wanted to fit in with the Westerners, because they were the world leaders, they were the growing power. I think this is a very good example of what caused Islam's downfall. It was not an insular conversion that they went totally against religion. I think the more and more that they met with outer civilizations, they realized that perhaps their way of living was something that was completely different. And it is the winners that are able to force their way of living onto the others. I mean, Indians were not able to force their way of living on the British. The British did it on us because usually they were the ones who dominated us for so many centuries. So when Islam, we are talking about at that time, I mean, there was a time when the Mughal Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire were the three richest and the three biggest empires in the world at the same time, all of them Muslims. It is said that, I mean, we all know, have heard of how Akbar was so, like, he was so religiously open, and we had the Din Ilahi and so many things about it. Then, of course, came Aurangzeb. So what led to this, like, if we take this in a nutshell, that this is a very, very good, small example we can take just in the Mughals. Again, I will go back to what I had said earlier. It was economics, because at that time when Akbar was the king, the Mughal empire was flourishing. He had the freedom to be able to incorporate whatever religious views he wanted. Then came the decadence of Jahangir, Shah Jahan, and so on, building the Taj Mahal, spending so much money. By the time Aurangzeb came to the throne, the treasury was emptying. There were a lot of foreign influences, as they put it in the court. They were losing their power. So what will any person at that point do? They will go back to something that worked before. And what he thought worked was, this is following the Islamic word of law. So I think this is a very good microcosm that we can take for what caused Islam to go from this brilliant scientific age to the conventional, or let's say orthodox reputation that it has today.
Okay, so basing my next question on the idea of Aurangzeb, so you were saying that, okay, there was a lot of economics and there were lots of reasons other than the religion. There were socio-economic reasons, there were political reasons.
Yeah.
So answer this. Why not Dara Shikoh, who was much more capable than Aurangzeb to actually lead the country? He was a scholar. He was actually, so for people who don't know, Dara Shikoh is the one who actually translated Upanishads into other languages, especially Arabic. And he was a great poet. He was a great scholar. He was the geek of the Mughals. And he was also very good with the idea of secularism that we have today. So wouldn't you say, Abhishek, that religion played a huge role in Aurangzeb maintaining the status of the emperor, and Dara Shikoh was thrown off he did not even have the chance to become the emperor of India. So I think religion had a huge role.
Yeah, well, this is a great point actually, to compare Dara Shikoh and Aurangzeb. This is because here I think our views clash, and this is a perfect example of it. What I will say is that, like, for people who don't know, Dara Shikoh was Shah Jahan's eldest son. He and Shah Jahan's favorite daughter, Jahanara, at the time were the real ruling power, because Shah Jahan, it is said, that went through a lot of grief after the death of Mumtaz, and these two were the real ruling power. Essentially, they lived in Delhi, in the opulence of the Mughal forts and the castles. Aurangzeb was the governor in the Deccan. He was the one who actually went into the field and saw that how the Mughal power was degrading. The Marathas were rising. There were a lot of revolts going on in the south, in the Deccan. He saw how the Mughal power was eroding, and he blamed it on the rise of Hindus in the Mughal court. It was very easy for Dara Shikoh and his ilk to be open, to be secular, when they did not see what was the ground reality. For them, the Mughal Empire was just a brilliant idea in their minds, that, it was an all-encompassing power, and he had free time to, as you say, he was indeed the first person who translated a lot of Hindu texts into Persian and Arabic, because he had a lot of free time in his hands, because he was not dealing with the ground realities. Aurangzeb at that time knew what the ground reality was in the various parts of the Mughal Empire, and this is indeed why he was able to beat Dara Shikoh so easily. He was a brilliant commander. He knew he had the respect of the troops. And a big part of that was because the core Mughal court, which was, of course, the Muslims, they realized this fact. Or at least not realized, they believed this fact, that the reason of their power erosion was the rise of Hindus in their court. And they symbolized Dara Shikoh as a perfect example of that. And thus they wanted to depose him and make Aurangzeb the king. So again, I would say you cannot take the socio-economic impact out of it. Dara Shikoh, as you say, might have been a brilliant leader for India. In fact, it is widely accepted he would have been a great ruler. But because he was never aware of the ground realities, of the socio-economic realities of the Mughal Empire at that time, I believe he was ill-suited to win and to rule.
Okay, so moving forward, what do you think is the perfect recipe of, because, well, this claim can always be made. For example, let's say in the current situation with Muslims, we can say that Muslims are, even though it's a huge minority, which is like bigger than most majorities of most countries, population wise, and so their impact on Indian politics is huge. And so would you say that, okay, there are socio-economic and political reasons, but don't you think like don't you feel, because this is what I feel when I communicate with most people, even from the Hindu community or from the Muslim community, that they do vote on the religious base. And this socio-economic politics is hugely, if not all of it, then some of it is actually based on the religious dogmas that are the foundation of these arguments. For example, let's say the Uniform Civil Code. Now, everywhere in the world, every single country, including most of Islamic countries, know that they have to get a uniform civil code for all their citizens. So if we as Indians change the definition of secularism, by the way, we have to define secularism for the audience, because most of the people, especially who are my friends and who have the opposing view, call me by names which are, well, not suited for this podcast. But secularism by definition means that there should be a separation between the religion and the state. So whatever your personal convictions are regarding your God has no space in the formation of laws for the country. But in India, it's not the definition of secularism. In India, the definition of secularism is that you have to be open to all the religions, which is very different from saying that you have to keep state out of the religion out of the affairs of state. And this is a huge problem, because now that we have this in place for our next generations who are coming, and even for the previous generations after the independence, we know for a fact that if we base our ideas on this definition of secularism, then we are going to doom the country for most of the part. So what do you feel that, what do you think? Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. What you say, that yes, a lot of politics in India, not only India, I mean, a lot of the world is dominated still by religion, which is totally and utterly wrong. I mean, I completely agree with you in this regard, that a personal religious beliefs should be totally separate from what the empirical way of running a country or politics or whatever it is. But how do we explain this to people? It is very easy for us to believe this because we have gone to different places in the world. We have been exposed to different cultures. We have had, thankfully, a pretty good education. But a lot of people in our country have not had that. Not only in our country, I mean, so much places of the world, people don't have access to basic needs, basic education. For them, religion is a way of coping, I believe. It is a coping mechanism for them. And when they believe that this coping mechanism gives them strength or the will to live, it is easy for them to vote for a party or for a government that will maintain the status quo. So I totally agree with you, but how do we change this? If you say that the answer is to totally eradicate religion or to teach people that don't believe in God, I think it will only invoke hostility. It is something that perhaps is something that will never be achieved in our lifetime. But the only answer to this, and here I think we can agree, is education. We have to teach people scientific, empirical method of education. But what my point is, we cannot do this hand in hand by taking away their religious beliefs. We cannot strip them of it. They have to remove that armor themselves. So this is perhaps where we have a little bit of a disagreement, because it is my belief that a person has to remove the religious armor themselves, and perhaps you feel that we have to facilitate that process. I mean, I don't know if you will agree with this statement.
Yeah, that's actually the most precise way to actually put this. But yeah, one thing which you said, which actually makes sense to me, that education is the key. But so for the viewers who don't know why we started this channel, this is not for some monetary benefit or anything. It's just that we had some convictions with us that we have to educate people how to actually think. So most of the time, people are educated. Indians are not poorly educated. Well, the literacy rate in India is not that good, but it's not that bad. So, but literacy rate actually means just writing or maybe reading. But the actual way of thinking critically is something which is not very intuitive to Indians, I believe. And to think critically, we have to have a certain level of sophistication in our mechanism for understanding how the world works and not just how the world works, but how it should work, and where should we drive the morality from. And most of the time, this argument comes up with me that uh, the science or the reason or the scientific method cannot teach you anything about morality, which I think is extremely wrong. Science has a lot to teach us about morality, because our moral actions, because morality is something which we can define as the acts that we undertake against certain aspects of life. So if those facts which are provided to us by scientific methods are the foundations which actually gives the authority to the fact forming mechanism in our heads to actually give out a very well informed idea of what morality should be. For example, when the America was being formed, the idea of America was being formed, most of these people were religious people, but still their constitution, even though there are words like God or something which is not so secular, but their constitution by its nature is extremely secular. And those people, for all its truth, were well advanced in how to separate church from the affairs of state. Why cannot we do that now? And if they could do it that many years ago, why can't we do it in the 21st century? People were poor at that time too there. People are poor here too. People were not well educated there too. People are not very well educated here too. So leadership, I think, plays a huge role. But Indian leadership thrives from any party. I'm not blaming any particular party. All these parties are not so good with actually putting these thoughts into place, and they want to exploit, and they are doing that by their virtue of their actions. They are exploiting these ideas and making their vote banks into place. So this is something which I feel. So maybe you can give a last comment on what you feel about all this, and then maybe we can wind up.
Yeah, so I agree with most of what you said. I mean, of course. But one thing I would like to point out, perhaps the USA is not the best example, because when the US was from the founding fathers of America, these were guys who had escaped from their home countries in Europe because of religious persecution. The essential founding fathers were people who wanted freedom. They were forming a completely different country which they could form from their own beliefs or whatever it was. We Indians, especially at this point, we do not have this luxury. We cannot go and form a new country. We have a 5,000-year-old civilization on our shoulders. It is not that easy, even though I agree with every principle that you mentioned, but it is not that easy for us to tell this to a billion people. Just forget about this 5,000-year-old civilization. The Americans, it was perhaps a unique example or situation. They could literally go and form a new country based on their own beliefs. I mean, even the Europeans, the British, the French, they struggled for a long time to remove this aspect of religion and state coexisting. It took them a long time, and I'm sure it will take us a long time as well, but I am a believer in knowing people's intuition and education, and I believe gradually over time we will be able to overcome this as well. Perhaps not in our lifetime, but I hope soon, one day soon.
Great. So I think this is a very good time for us to stop this conversation. We will keep moving further with discussions like this. So I want to thank the audience and thank Abhishek for being in this conversation. And also I would like to ask people who are listening to this podcast, if they have any questions or if they have any comments, they can send us their comments or their views through the comment section below. Or if they want to send us a video message or an audio message or a written text which is personal, then they can send it to us at knightsofreasonindia@gmail.com. You can also follow us on our Instagram page, which is Knights of Reason. So you can follow us there. And thank you for being with us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone, and have a good time. Stay safe.
Yeah.